The heavy iron gates of the Reed family estate stood wide open under the golden afternoon sun, warmly welcoming the city's elite guests to a lavish ruby anniversary celebration. I stepped out of my rusted, sputtering Ford truck and immediately shattered the elegant harmony of soft jazz floating across the manicured lawns with the noisy engine sputter. Dressed in a mud-stained Carhartt jacket, faded denim, and battered combat boots, I walked straight into the pristine environment with deliberate, unyielding, and completely purposeful steps. The wealthy guests parted instantly, like the Red Sea, their polite high society smiles twisting into expressions of unrestrained disgust and shock as I approached their gathering. They stared at me as though a rabid animal had wandered into their exclusive sanctuary, whispering harsh judgments about the soil tracking onto their expensive stone pathways. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, completely tuning out their shallow revulsion through years of hardened military discipline and unshakable inner focus amidst the sudden chaos. Before I could reach the center of the terrace, my father abruptly abandoned a circle of wealthy politicians, his face flushing a furious, humiliated, and deep crimson shade. He marched right up to me, aggressively blocking my path, with eyes blazing with the same cold, absolute contempt he had shown me since my early childhood years. "Are you here to smear my name on this day, Sarah?" he hissed softly, his voice a venomous whisper designed to avoid a public scene before the guests. The long years of military endurance had prepared me for this confrontation today. Before I could even draw breath to answer his cruel accusation, my mother stepped forward, her expensive diamond jewelry sparkling aggressively in the bright afternoon sunlight. She did not bother lowering her voice or pretending to maintain polite social etiquette before the stunned crowd of high society guests and visiting international dignitaries today. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her tone shrieking with an unhinged, deeply ingrained venom that cut clearly through the sudden, oppressive silence. "Go back to that filthy garbage dump with your crippled, broken soldiers," she spat, her face contorted with pure, unfiltered rage and deep family embarrassment before everyone. Hearing my own mother publicly degrade the bravest men I had ever known was a sickening physical blow that made my aching chest throb even more sharply. They were infinitely more offended by the honest dirt on my work jacket than they were by the fact that their daughter stood begging for urgent financial help. It was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation that the Reed family crest was built entirely on hollow vanity, and that I was nothing more than a shameful secret. I swallowed my burning pride instantly, biting down on my lips so hard I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my dry, parched mouth. I deliberately ignored their venomous insults, sidestepping their blocking stance to walk straight toward my brother, who watched the humiliating spectacle with an arrogant smirk. I stood before them completely unbowed and resolute, ready to face the absolute worst of their accumulated hatred right now. Daniel was standing casually by the outdoor marble bar, his massive, muscular frame leaning back with a smug, victorious grin plastered across his arrogant face. He knew precisely why I was standing on his lawn in muddy boots, and he was thoroughly enjoying every excruciating second of my public desperation and pain today. I looked him dead in the eye, stripping away every single ounce of my Marine Corps ego, and laid myself completely bare before my lifelong tormentor and abuser. Daniel, write the $500,000 check to clear the loan, and I will pay you back with heavy interest over time, I pleaded softly. Just stop the foreclosure auction, please. I am begging you, I added, my voice tight with a raw desperation I had sworn never to show him ever again. Next to him, my sister-in-law, Patricia, dramatically whipped out a silk designer handkerchief, covered her nose, and rolled her eyes for the watching audience of wealthy elites. Oh my God. Kick her out immediately. Her wretched stench is making me physically nauseous. She sneered loudly, her weaponized disgust designed to deepen my humiliation further. The surrounding elite guests murmured in enthusiastic agreement, fully supporting her casual cruelty with nodding heads and whispered laughter that echoed across the lawn. I did not blink or look away, keeping my unwavering gaze locked entirely on my brother, willing to endure any psychological torture to save our camp. My tactical patience was absolute, knowing that every cruel word he uttered was merely a stepping stone toward his own downfall. My brother threw his head back and emitted a booming, theatrical laugh designed to draw the eager attention of every single guest attending the milestone anniversary. He slowly reached inside his tailored Italian suit jacket, pulled out a heavy leather checkbook, and scrawled his signature with a gleaming gold fountain pen. He tore the check for $500,000 free from the binding, and with deliberate, crushing disrespect, threw it directly onto the dirt at my feet. You want $500,000 to save that pathetic garbage dump full of your crippled veterans? He sneered, his voice dripping with absolute and pure malice. Step inside that ring over there and last 3 minutes in a sparring match with me right now, he challenged, his broad chest swelling with immense arrogance. If you drop to the grass by tomorrow morning, I will drive the bulldozer myself and flatten every single cabin to the ground, he threatened very loudly. The wealthy crowd gasped in collective shock, but quickly dissolved into excited, bloodthirsty whispers, eagerly anticipating a brutal display of physical dominance on the grass today. My father raised his crystal wine glass in enthusiastic agreement, openly cheering for the public beating of his own flesh and blood on the manicured lawn. Teach her a harsh lesson. Let her finally wake up from her pathetic delusions, my father cheered, fully endorsing the cruel violence before the elite audience. They watched with sadistic glee, completely unaware that the arrogant trap they had gleefully set was about to snap shut around them. I looked down slowly at the small piece of paper resting in the dirt, thinking of old Mac's tears and the veterans who relied entirely on my strength. I did not argue, I did not scream, and I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing my military composure fracture under their immense psychological pressure. Instead, I quietly nodded my head, accepting the brutal terms of this blood contract in exchange for the safety of the men who mattered most in life. If you have ever had to swallow your pride and endure unimaginable humiliation just to protect the innocent people you love, you will understand my choice. The wealthy elite guests, eagerly formed a wide, bloodthirsty circle on the manicured lawn, holding their champagne flutes tight like ancient Roman spectators in an arena. My parents took prime VIP seats on the patio, swirling their drinks in excited anticipation of my impending physical punishment on the green grass of the estate. I stood in the exact center of the lawn, feeling the heavy weight of their collective hatred pressing down on my tired shoulders like a crushing anvil. Slowly and deliberately, I bent down and began to undo the thick, muddy laces of my heavy combat boots, sliding them off to step onto the lawn. My bare feet touched the imported soft grass, calloused and scarred from years of grueling combat deployments, ready to face whatever darkness my brother brought today. The final battle for our freedom had officially begun, and failure was never an option on this sacred ground. The rich, heavy scent of Daniel's expensive designer cologne drifted across the lawn, acting as an instant catalyst that violently dragged my senses backward through time. It hit me like a physical blow, instantly transporting me 20 years into the past, within the suffocating, immaculate corridors of the sprawling Reed family estate. That exact same twisted, condescending sneer had haunted my childhood nightmares for 2 decades, belonging to a brother taught from birth that he owned the world. Standing with my bare, scarred feet sinking into the imported grass, I felt the oppressive weight of elite expectations crashing down on my shoulders once again. Daniel looked at me then, just as he looked at me now, exactly like a defective toy he could not wait to break for his own amusement. The terrified little girl he used to torment died a long time ago, buried under years of military discipline, survival instincts, and unyielding tactical resolve. Yet, for a fleeting split second, the sheer cruelty of his gaze threatened to paralyze my inner child, demanding that I submit to his unearned authority. When I was 15 years old, the brutal hierarchy of the estate was already carved in stone and enforced daily by parents who groomed him as the golden child. Every minor sports trophy he won was celebrated with lavish banquets, while my quiet academic achievements were shoved into dusty drawers, unread, forcing me to become an invisible ghost. The long journey of healing had taught me to wear those deep scars like armor rather than fragile chains today. 2 years later, when I was 17, the final fragile illusion of family safety was shattered forever inside the grand, silent dining room of the mansion. I had spent 3 grueling months building a complex mechanical engineering project for a state competition, pouring all my desperate need for validation into its intricate gears. One afternoon, Daniel walked in, saw the project taking up space on the table, and casually smashed it to pieces with a golf club. Simply because he could. When I cried, devastated by the ruins of my hard work, my father merely sighed in annoyance while sipping his expensive scotch by the wide window pane. "Don't be so incredibly sensitive, Sarah," my father muttered coldly. "He's just expressing himself. Clean up this messy wreckage." It was in that exact crushing moment I realized empathy and vulnerability were considered fatal diseases in a house that worshipped ruthless dominance and power. They viewed his malice as strength and my tears as a pathetic weakness, forcing me to stop crying that day and sweep up the final shreds of hope. I locked my bedroom door that night and made a silent, ironclad promise to myself that I would never shed another tear for the Reed family again. Exactly 3 days after my 18th birthday, I executed the final decision that would permanently alter the trajectory of my whole life by walking away into the midnight dark. Every broken fragment became part of a larger story of survival that no amount of aristocratic wealth could ever hope to rewrite or erase. A week after abandoning the suffocating walls of the mansion, I marched straight into a Marine Corps recruiting station that smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. The grisly recruiter looked at my soft, manicured hands and raised a skeptical eyebrow, doubting a wealthy runaway could survive the brutal military machine. When I spoke, my voice was dead calm, and I eagerly signed away my civilian freedom, trading silk bedsheets for heavy, blister-inducing combat boots without hesitation. The stark contrast was jarring. Yet stepping out of that strip mall office with a shipping date in hand gave me profound ownership over my own life. 6 months later, the grueling reality of the Paris Island crucible pushed me to the absolute limits of human endurance, breaking me down before rebuilding me. The screaming drill instructors did not care about my last name or family wealth. I was judged strictly by my grit, refusal to quit, and loyalty to others. When I dragged a heavier recruit through the mud under barbed wire while live rounds echoed overhead, I realized my inherent empathy was a tactical asset. The military stripped away the victimhood my brother had forced upon me, replacing it with the hardened, calloused pride of a warrior who earned every breath. When they pinned the eagle, globe, and anchor emblem to my uniform, I knew I had successfully rewritten my DNA to become a United States Marine forever. Walking out of that recruiting station was my first true step toward reclaiming a soul that had long been imprisoned by expectations. During my first combat deployment overseas, the isolating reality of war momentarily cracked my armored shell while stationed in a dusty, sweltering tent in Afghanistan. Surrounded by Marines excitedly reading letters from home, a moment of profound weakness overtook me. And I craved just one single word of validation from my family. I wrote a brief letter to my parents stating I was alive, and I checked the mail call every single week for months, only to be met by silence. The agonizing silence was a physical blow, confirming that my bloodline had officially and permanently erased me, turning my old bedroom into another one of his private gyms. That unanswered letter was the final nail in the coffin of my childhood, prompting me to burn my parents' address mentally and sever the last fragile tether. Over the next decade, I earned my officer rank through tactical brilliance and an uncompromising refusal to fail, turning deep-seated pain into cold, calculating leadership. I led troops through blistering firefights with a steady hand, becoming an absolute fortress on the outside while keeping my fractured pieces together in the dark. Yet beneath the Kevlar and metals, the inner child still bled, creating a permanent dissonance between the hero I was to strangers and the failure to my blood. In the filthy, blood-stained trenches, however, I finally found what my parents never gave me: absolute, unconditional loyalty, and a brotherhood that ran deeper than genes. The military became my true home, teaching me that genuine courage is forged in the fires of shared adversity. It was during one of those brutal deployments that I met Old Mac, a fierce, grizzled sergeant who had lost his leg shielding his young squad from a blast. While recovering in the hospital, his only concern was the mental well-being of the men he saved. Becoming my mentor, compass, and true surrogate father figure. Mac taught me that true, enduring strength is not about crushing people to assert dominance, but willingly absorbing pain so the broken ones can stand again. His quiet wisdom became the anchor for my sanity, proving that family is defined by sacrifice and unconditional support rather than a shared name on a certificate. Returning stateside, the sickening reality of how civilian society discards its veterans hit me harder than any enemy ambush, fueling a righteous, burning mission within me. I cashed out my life savings, combat pay, and pension to buy a rusted, abandoned farm, working side by side with Mac to build Camp Freedom from the dirt. We transformed that forgotten plot into a sanctuary for veterans battling PTSD and homelessness, creating a fortress of absolute safety, isolated from the Reed bloodline. Standing now on the manicured lawn of the estate, stripped of my combat gear, I carried the collective strength of every soldier I had ever saved inside my heart. The ghosts of my past could no longer touch me, for I was anchored by a love far greater than any aristocratic fortune could ever hope to buy. Every hardship I endured had prepared me to protect the fragile dignity of discarded heroes. Returning stateside after my final combat deployment, the bitter, sickening reality of how modern civilian society treats its combat veterans hit me with the devastating impact of an enemy ambush. I walked the clean, peaceful, paved streets of the city and personally witnessed men I had fought alongside, men who had sacrificed their minds and bodies for this country, ending up homeless and discarded. The affluent elite classes, people who looked exactly like my parents and my arrogant brother, stepped over these broken heroes on the concrete sidewalks in utter, unforgivable disgust, treating them like literal trash. I watched wealthy businessmen in tailored Italian suits recoil from amputees begging for change on the corner, entirely blind to the fact that their luxurious, comfortable freedom was paid for by the blood of ignored men. The boiling anger that had simmered silently inside my chest since my earliest childhood suddenly found a new, righteous, and unbreakable target to focus upon. I knew deep within my soul that while I could not save my own biological family from their toxic, bottomless vanity, I absolutely refused to let my brothers in arms be thrown away by a heartless society. That sickening, pervasive injustice fueled a fresh, burning mission within my spirit, giving my post-military life a desperate, essential, and holy purpose that transcended any personal grief. I knew I had to act decisively, utilizing every single resource, skill, and ounce of strength I had left, to protect the only family that had ever truly mattered to my healing heart. With absolute clarity, I prepared to sever every remaining tie that bound me to the life I was born into. Exactly 2 years ago, I made the irreversible decision that completely severed my final tattered ties to a comfortable, conventional life of suburban privilege. I marched straight into the commercial bank downtown, cashed out my entire accumulated life savings, my hazard combat pay, and my military pension, down to the very last cent. I took every single cent I owned and purchased a rusted, sprawling, abandoned farm situated on the desolate, windswept outskirts of town. Working side by side with old Mac from dawn until dusk, I used my own blistered, calloused hands to rebuild the collapsed cabin roofs, repair the ancient plumbing, and clear the overgrown fields. We transformed that forgotten, weed-choked plot of dirt into a dedicated, loving sanctuary, specifically designed for veterans battling severe post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic homelessness, and crippling addiction. I named the refuge Camp Freedom, refusing to let it be a luxury resort, knowing its roofs leaked and its old heaters rattled violently through the bitter winter nights. Instead, it became a fortress of absolute psychological safety, where these discarded soldiers finally had a secure place to sleep, a place to heal, and a daily purpose to wake up to. As I watched old Mac hoist the American flag up the newly painted wooden pole on our first official morning, a profound, overwhelming sense of peace washed over my weary spirit. I had finally built the secure, loving home I never had as a child. Entirely safe, entirely sacred, and completely isolated from the toxic, destructive reach of the Reed family. For 3 brief, fragile weeks, we finally found a delicate yet beautiful rhythm of recovery and community at Camp Freedom that felt nothing short of miraculous. The veterans were actively attending their weekly group therapy sessions. The vegetable gardens we planted were thriving under the summer sun, and the air was filled with hope. For the first time in years, the quiet night air was not violently pierced by the terrifying sound of someone screaming from a sudden, paralyzing combat night terror. We were collectively healing, stitching our jagged, invisible wounds together in the safety of shared silence and mutual, unconditional understanding. But then, the certified, heavy legal letter arrived in the mail one Tuesday afternoon, instantly shattering our hard-earned peace with terrifying finality. I opened the thick manila envelope inside my cramped office, my stomach dropping into an abyss as I read the cold, unforgiving corporate language printed on heavy cardstock. The commercial bank had quietly sold our remaining property debt to an aggressive private shell company that had acquired it with a predatory short-term repair loan. The new shadowy owners had immediately accelerated the payment deadline, demanding a sudden, impossible $500,000 lump sum to clear the title, an amount we could never hope to raise. I sat at my battered wooden desk, staring at the impossible numbers, feeling the exact same icy terror I used to experience during an unexpected enemy ambush in the dark. I knew that every second counted now if we wanted to survive this calculated corporate onslaught aimed straight at our fragile home. The terrifying floor was dropping out from underneath our fragile sanctuary, placing the only safe home these wounded men had left on the absolute brink of total collapse. I had absolutely no idea who was pulling the strings behind the corporate veil, though I knew that institutional banking buyouts and corporate takeovers were notoriously ruthless. Yet, the sheer speed, malice, and tactical ferocity of this sudden financial takeover felt deeply personal, resembling a targeted missile strike aimed directly at our foundation. Desperate to find a legal loophole or an administrative error, I spent the next 48 hours buried under an overwhelming mountain of complex legal paperwork. I dug frantically into the state corporate registry, tracing the Phantom Shell Company through a labyrinth of obscure LLCs and holding groups, trying to unmask the faceless billionaire. Finally, deep within the state tax records, buried beneath 3 distinct layers of corporate shielding designed specifically to hide true ownership, my trembling finger stopped dead. My eyes locked onto the CEO's signature, printed at the very bottom of the deed transfer document, where the fresh ink and unmistakable handwriting told an undeniable story. It was the arrogant, oversized capital letter D that I had seen scrawled across 1,000 childhood birthday cards that were never actually meant for me. Daniel Reed. The horrific realization hit me like a devastating physical punch to the solar plexus, turning my breathing shallow as the chilling truth settled over my racing mind. The game was rigged from the start by a man who enjoyed destroying lives for pure sport. My brother did not need this cheap rural land for any legitimate commercial purpose, seeing as he already owned luxury high-rises and premium fitness centers across the entire state. This was never a routine business acquisition or a standard real estate investment. It was a cold-blooded, personal assassination of everything I held dear. He had spent what amounted to mere pocket change for a man of his immense wealth to buy my crippling debt, specifically to crush my sanctuary out of pure spite. He simply could not tolerate the fact that I had built an honorable life without his explicit permission. A life where I refused to bow to the Reed family fortune. He wanted to watch me fail spectacularly, hoping to prove to himself and society that my military service and my beloved veterans were utterly worthless compared to his capitalistic power. The sheer, calculating malice of his actions made my blood run ice cold, confirming that he was intentionally turning my brothers in arms out onto the streets just for fun. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the casual cruelty of my childhood was not just a passing phase of youth. Cruelty was his permanent, defining character trait, an inherent rot of the soul that he wore like a badge of honor among the elite. With the deadline looming, and the lives of my veterans hanging by a thread, I knew I had no choice left but to return to the lion's den, regardless of cost. The sharp chime of the silver bell above the portable octagon's entrance rang out into the humid afternoon air, signaling the official start of our brutal 3-minute contract. Daniel roared like an enraged wild animal, lunging forward with terrifying, highly practiced mixed martial arts speed. Fully blinded by his own towering, unearned arrogance. He expected zero physical resistance from a woman he had spent a lifetime dismissing as a broken, fragile runaway, unworthy of sharing his prestigious family name. Without bothering to test my distance or throw a probing jab, he went straight for a devastating, skull-shattering overhand right punch aimed squarely at my face. The sheer, raw, kinetic energy behind his massive fist was more than enough to snap a normal opponent's jaw into a dozen splintered, jagged pieces instantly. The wealthy spectators holding their champagne flutes collectively held their breath, waiting for the sickening crunch of my collapse and eager to see me put down. Time seemed to dilate and stretch into a slow crawl as his knuckles closed the distance, his eyes wide with a sadistic, unhinged joy at finally destroying me. Yet, rather than retreating in blind panic, I deliberately forced my body against every natural human instinct, tucking my chin tight and angling my head downward. I chose to absorb his catastrophic blow directly upon the thickest, hardest part of my skull, trusting the unyielding conditioning of my combat training to protect me. My military instincts took absolute control of my nervous system, preparing me to execute the necessary defensive maneuvers to protect our future. A bone-jarring, sickening crack echoed sharply across the manicured lawn, loud enough to make several high society guests gasp in absolute horror and drop their crystal glasses. Daniel stumbled violently backward with a sharp, hissing intake of breath, clutching his bruised, bleeding knuckles as a wave of sudden agony rippled through his hand. A flash of blinding white light exploded behind my retinas, and warm, metallic blood immediately filled my mouth as my split lips slammed against my teeth. The concussive shock rattled my brain severely, but the blinding pain did not break my spirit. Instead, it flipped my military killer switch with terrifying precision. The exhausted, pleading sister vanished into thin air, instantly replaced by a highly trained close-quarters combat specialist locked onto her primary tactical target. Pain was an old, familiar friend, a reliable metric telling me I was still breathing, still fighting, and that the man before me had made a fatal error. Furious and deeply bewildered that I was still standing upright on the grass, my brother's face twisted into an ugly, distorted mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Abandoning all pretense of disciplined striking, he launched a ruthless, high-arc roundhouse kick aimed straight at my temple in a desperate attempt to knock me out cold. Yet I moved with lightning speed, stepping directly inside the devastating arc of his leg before his strike could reach its full velocity to neutralize the force. Every fiber of my being screamed from the impact, but my tactical focus remained crystal clear as I prepared for our next engagement. By closing the distance instantly, I completely killed the momentum of his high kick, turning what should have been a knockout blow into a dull thud against my ribs. Using his own massive, unbalanced weight and forward momentum against him, I shoved both of my open palms hard into the center of his tailored suit shirt. The sudden, violent redirection of force sent him tumbling backward, his arms flailing wildly as he crashed unceremoniously onto the grass before the utterly horrified crowd. The smug, Self-satisfied smiles on my parents' faces instantly melted into expressions of absolute paralyzed shock as they watched their golden boy hit the dirt. I stood tall, slowly wiped the thick streak of crimson blood from my split lip with the back of my hand, and lowered my center of gravity smoothly. Dropping into a lethal, perfectly balanced infantry combat stance, my hands remained loose, my eyes dead and focused, radiating the chilling aura of a professional soldier. My brother scrambled up from the ruined, mud-stained grass like a cornered, desperate animal, his perfectly styled hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and spilled champagne. Realizing that striking at a distance was suicide against my military training, he rushed forward frantically, abandoning all sportsmanship to force a chaotic, heavy clinch. In the tangled web of struggling limbs, he drove a cowardly, brutal knee strike upward into my exposed left side, shattering my guard with explosive malice. The tables had completely turned, and the bully who had tormented my childhood was finally facing a professional warrior who refused to yield. A sickening, bone-snapping crack echoed sharply over the estate lawn, loud enough to cut through the heavy silence as my lower ribs splintered under the heavy impact. A wave of blinding, white-hot agony tore through my chest, severely bruising the intercostal muscles and making every breath feel like inhaling shards of sharp glass. From the VIP sidelines, my sister-in-law Patricia let out a high-pitched shriek of absolute delight, thrilled to witness my physical suffering and impending humiliation. To my profound disgust, my own biological father actually clapped his hands in enthusiastic applause, openly cheering for the violent destruction of his own daughter. Yet, they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of pain. On the battlefield, pain is never a deterrent, but rather a tactical catalyst, providing raw, vital data for survival. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a whimper or cry, biting down on my bleeding lips so hard to absorb the agonizing fire within. Instead of folding in half like the helpless victim they desperately expected, I straightened my spine, my gaze sharpening into an unblinking stare that made him falter. Ignoring the searing fire tearing through my fractured ribcage, I executed a lethal counterstrike, drilled into my muscle memory 1,000 times during grueling deployments. Before he could pull his knee back, I plunged my stiffened, spear-like fingers straight into the soft, vulnerable hollow of his throat to compromise his airway instantly. He gasped for air in utter disbelief, realizing too late that street brawling could never match the lethal precision of infantry combat training. Daniel gagged violently, his eyes bulging in sudden, unmitigated terror as his oxygen supply was choked off and his vice-like grip on my arms loosened completely. I did not give him a single fraction of a second to recover, grabbing a fistful of his sweat-drenched hair to yank his heavy head backward viciously. Delivering a devastating, bone-jarring military cross-face strike directly to the side of his chin, I completely short-circuited his equilibrium and shattered his balance. Without missing a single beat, I swept his lead leg, slamming his massive heavyweight frame back down onto the muddy grass for the second time today. Dropping my weight instantly, I slid into a full, inescapable mount directly on his chest, pinning his flailing arms firmly beneath my knees with calculated leverage. The surrounding crowd of elite socialites was suffocatingly silent, paralyzed by the raw, unfiltered violence of a trained soldier executing a textbook neutralization maneuver. Slipping my bloodied hands past his desperate defense, I applied a brutal, bare-handed Ezekiel choke, driving my forearm against his carotid artery to stop the blood flow. 10, 9, 8, I whispered coldly, audibly counting down his demise so only he could hear the inevitable approach of his total, crushing defeat. The mighty MMA champion raised a trembling hand and weakly tapped out on my shoulder in absolute disgrace, proving that true discipline always conquers unearned privilege. The golden boy of the Reed family was forced to submit to his estranged sister, realizing that millions of dollars meant nothing in a real fight. The heavy silence that fell across the immaculate estate lawn was sudden, absolute, and suffocating, resembling the pressure drop before a major storm hits the harbor. My mother and father stood paralyzed by their velvet VIP chairs, their expensive crystal wine glasses trembling violently within their manicured, wealthy hands. They stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, looking at me not as a daughter who had just defended her dignity, but as an unpredictable, dangerous force. The woman standing before them, bleeding, battered, and bruised, was an utter stranger to them, completely unbound by their expectations or their cold approval. Their immense wealth, high society standing, and aristocratic titles were entirely useless against the raw, unfiltered reality of a professional soldier's unyielding military discipline. There would be no tearful family reconciliation, no warm apologies, and no welcoming return to the fold of a dynasty built entirely upon shifting sand. The terrified silence of the elite crowd was the loudest answer I could ever hope to receive, confirming that I was an outcast by their superficial standards. Yet, as I looked across the ruined grass, I knew that being an outcast from a toxic, unloving family was the greatest liberation of my entire life. Richard, the aging family butler, slowly approached me through the quiet crowd, his polished shoes crunching softly against the torn blades of grass under the evening sky. The long journey of healing had taught me that true strength comes from within, far away from the superficial vanity of the elite. His hands were trembling so visibly that he could barely maintain his grip as he reached down to pick up the mud-stained check from the ground. He held out the $500,000 check toward me, his aged eyes cast downward in a profound, unspoken mixture of fear and deep-seated, enduring respect. Having worked for the Reed family for decades, he knew precisely how much abuse I had endured, and had just witnessed me conquer my lifelong tormentor. I snatched the check from his shaking fingers without uttering a single word, feeling the immense weight of our salvation resting safely within my palm. The small piece of paper felt incredibly heavy, carrying the full weight of my dignity, my cracked rib, and the bright future of Camp Freedom. I carefully folded the check and slid it securely into the breast pocket of my Carhartt jacket, pressing it firmly against my aching, bruised chest. The financial ransom had been paid in full, extracted not through begging or submission, but through the absolute, undeniable force of personal boundaries and strength. The transaction was entirely complete, meaning I no longer owed Arthur or Daniel anything whatsoever for the rest of my natural life on this earth. Every sacrifice I had made over the past years had culminated in this transformative moment of absolute restoration and victory. I felt no hesitation as I pocketed the evidence of our hard-fought freedom, knowing that the dark shadow of the Reed family could no longer reach into our sanctuary today. Ignoring the searing pain shooting fiercely through my fractured ribcage, I slowly bent down and laced up my battered, heavy combat boots once more. I pulled the laces tight with practiced, deliberate movements, securing my footing upon the earth that had just witnessed my ultimate spiritual and physical liberation. Standing straight at full attention, with my spine aligned and shoulders squared, I swept a cold, utterly disgusted gaze across the entire silent patio. I looked down at my gasping, humiliated brother, who was still clutching his throat in the mud, completely stripped of his arrogant, toxic bravado. I looked at my sister-in-law, cowering behind a gilded chair. And finally, I locked eyes with my parents, letting them see the chilling void inside my heart. The desperate need for their parental love that had haunted my childhood was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable indifference to their shallow judgment. Without offering a single parting speech or shedding a single tear, I turned my back upon my biological bloodline forever and walked away with pride. The elite crowd parted silently in sheer terror as I strode through their ranks toward the heavy iron estate gates standing open in the dusk. The silence of the night air enveloped me like a protective cloak as I took my final steps away from the grounds of my imprisonment. I carried my fractured ribs and bruised face with immense pride, knowing they were the true badges of honor earned in defense of those who truly mattered today. The massive iron gates of the estate closed behind me with a resounding metallic clang, serving as the physical manifestation of a permanent and unbreakable boundary. Inside the rusted cabin of my Ford truck, the explosive combat adrenaline finally began to fade, replaced by a crashing wave of deep physical exhaustion. Every time the heavy tires hit a pothole on the winding highway, my cracked ribs screamed in white-hot agony, sending sharp gasps through my chest. Yet my right fist remained tightly, stubbornly closed around that folded check in my pocket, holding onto it like a sacred lifeline of freedom. The physical agony was an incredibly cheap, gladly paid price for our absolute liberation from a lifetime of emotional enslavement and silent suffering. I rolled down the window, letting the biting night air rush into the cabin to wash away the suffocating scent of expensive cologne and champagne. the road ahead no longer felt like a lonely escape route, but rather a purposeful, triumphant march toward a genuine and unburdened future. I was driving away from a mansion filled with strangers and heading directly toward a dilapidated farm filled with my true, chosen family. The miles slipped away beneath my heavy truck tires, while the haunting memories of my youth finally dissolved into the peaceful darkness of dawn. I knew that the road ahead would still require hard work and dedication, but I possessed an unshakable inner anchor to weather any storm today. Dawn was just beginning to break over the rugged horizon in bruised streaks of gold and deep purple as I reached Camp Freedom's iron gates. Sitting exactly where I had left him, by the entrance, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, was Old Mac, keeping a desperate, sleepless vigil all night. He looked up at the sound of my squealing brakes, his aged face pale and his eyes red from crying all night in absolute despair. When he saw me step out of the truck with a stiff limp and a bruised face, terror melted into a tearful smile of relief. I walked over and placed the folded check gently into his weathered palms, whispering softly, "We are safe, Mac. The camp belongs to us." The old warrior gripped my shoulder with fierce, trembling strength, offering the unconditional love and pride my biological father had always withheld. Staring up at the American flag snapping fiercely in the wind, a profound realization washed over me. I had successfully protected my real family. The trauma of my childhood was finally laid to rest in the dirt, and my scars became the hard-earned medals of my ultimate liberation. The veterans stepped out into the golden morning light, and I walked confidently toward them, stepping into a future where I was entirely free. Sometimes the family we build from shared scars is infinitely stronger than the one we were born into, bringing lasting peace and redemption today. In the quiet weeks following the explosive confrontation on the estate's manicured lawn, the invincible empire of the Reed family began to crumble from within. Daniel's multi-million-dollar mixed martial arts enterprise and commercial real estate portfolio faced a devastating, immediate public backlash after the viral livestream exposed his cruelty. Major corporate sponsors terminated their multi-year contracts overnight, while angry public protests outside his downtown headquarters forced his cowardly resignation from the board of directors. My mother and father, cocooned for decades within their golden cage of aristocratic denial, suddenly found themselves utterly abandoned by the social elite who once courted them. Stripped of their flattering sycophants and endless streams of social validation, the toxic foundation of their superficial marriage fractured under the crushing weight of public disgrace. Arthur spent his remaining days sitting alone in the silent, cavernous drawing rooms of the sprawling mansion, staring blankly at family portraits that meant nothing anymore. Victoria packed up her designer wardrobes and expensive jewelry, retreating into an isolated condominium to nurse her wounded pride, far away from her broken husband. The grand, merciless dynasty that had weaponized its wealth to crush empathy and human dignity was finally brought low by the quiet, unstoppable force of truth. they were left to wander through the ruins of their own manufactured isolation, realizing too late that money can buy every luxury except genuine human love. The devastating downfall served as a powerful reminder to the world that karma always balances the scales of justice in the end. Back at Camp Freedom, the golden light of autumn painted the newly repaired cabin roofs in rich shades of amber, orange, and deep, comforting brown. With the $500,000 debt successfully cleared and the property title secured forever, our sanctuary entered a profound, unprecedented season of stability and healing. The veterans no longer lived under the terrifying, paralyzing shadow of sudden displacement, allowing their fractured nervous systems to finally relax and begin mending. Old Mac spent his afternoons teaching woodworking and carving to younger soldiers in the sunlight, his infectious laughter echoing across the green vegetable gardens. I walked the gravel pathways every morning, greeting each resident by name, feeling the sharp physical ache in my ribs slowly fade into a dull, harmless memory. The organic crops we planted together flourished under our collective care, providing nourishing meals that brought a sense of shared community and purposeful belonging. We established a peer-led counseling program that gave these wounded heroes the tools to confront their combat trauma without shame, judgment, or fear. Camp Freedom transformed from a fragile, leaking emergency shelter into a permanent, thriving fortress of absolute safety, dignity, and unconditional mutual respect. Every smiling face and peaceful night's sleep proved that love and shared sacrifice are infinitely more powerful than any corporate monopoly or cruel family curse. Every single obstacle we had successfully overcome together only cemented our unbreakable bond of brotherhood, ensuring that our sanctuary would stand firm against any future storms that might ever threaten our peaceful existence in this quiet valley today. Oh, on a crisp, clear Saturday morning in late October, a sleek black sedan pulled slowly up our dusty dirt driveway and stopped near the flagpole. My heart skipped a beat as the passenger door clicked open and a silver-haired, slightly stooped figure stepped cautiously out onto the gravel path. It was Arthur, dressed not in his usual bespoke Italian suit, but in a simple, unbranded wool coat that made him look remarkably small and fragile. He stood looking up at the snapping American flag for a long moment before his tired eyes met mine across the open expanse of the yard. I did not run away, nor did I raise my defenses. I simply walked over to him with steady, measured steps, keeping my posture calm and open. "May I walk with you around the camp, Sarah?" he asked softly, his voice trembling with a vulnerability I had never heard in my entire life. We strolled side by side past the vegetable beds and the cozy cabins, the silence between us filled not with tension, but with the weight of unspoken truth. I lost everything I thought mattered, Chloe. Sarah, he corrected himself gently, tears spilling over his weathered cheeks. And losing it all was the only way I could finally see how terribly I had failed you. The morning breeze rustled through the tall pine trees, while the other veterans watched from a respectful distance, giving us the sacred space to converse without judgment or interruption as the sun climbed higher into the clear blue autumn sky today. I stopped near the edge of the creek, turning to face the man who had once been the terrifying, untouchable architect of my childhood's deepest sorrows. For the first time in 36 years, I saw him not as an omnipotent tyrant or a towering monster, but as a deeply flawed, lonely human being. You cannot undo the past, Arthur, and I cannot erase the years of silence and cruelty that built this divide between us, I said with absolute calm. But healing is a choice we make every single day, and it starts by taking full accountability for the wreckage we leave behind us. He nodded slowly, accepting my boundaries without a single trace of his former arrogance, acknowledging that trust must be earned through patient, consistent actions. I don't expect you to ever call me father or forgive the unforgivable, he whispered, gazing down at his trembling, aged hands with deep remorse. I only wanted to see the honorable life you built with your own hands, and to tell you how profoundly proud of you I truly am. Those simple, long-awaited words hung softly in the autumn air, acting as a gentle balm that finally closed the oldest, deepest wound in my soul. We parted ways that afternoon without grand promises, yet the invisible shackles binding my spirit to his generational trauma were officially broken forever. The heavy burden of seeking parental approval that had haunted my entire childhood vanished into the wind, replaced by an empowering sense of emotional autonomy. That evening, sitting alone on the front porch of my cabin, while the distant stars began to pierce the twilight sky, a profound peace filled my soul. I looked down at my calloused, scarred hands that had held combat rifles in foreign trenches, built fences in the desert, and fought for survival. Those same hands had now successfully forged a permanent sanctuary where broken soldiers could lay down their heavy burdens and find new life. The bitter anger and desperate need for parental validation that had driven my early choices had entirely dissolved into a radiant, unshakable self-love. I realized that true liberation does not come from destroying our enemies or seeking vengeance against those who underestimated our inherent worth. True liberation is born when we learn to establish sacred boundaries, protect the vulnerable, and build a life of authentic purpose from our own shared scars. The Reed family legacy of ruthless greed and emotional neglect died in the dirt of that estate, replaced by a living legacy of courage, healing, and grace. I breathed in the crisp night air, feeling the unbreakable strength of my true chosen family surrounding me in the quiet darkness of the sanctuary. The battle was finally over. The wounds were closed, and I was standing victoriously in the brilliant, unburdened dawn of my absolute and enduring freedom. With a calm heart and an unshakable spirit, I stepped forward into a future filled with infinite possibilities, knowing that my greatest victory was finding peace within myself.